No Caesars, no Colosseum, no unified Mediterranean. Imagine a world where the name Rome literally means nothing to you. No sweeping conquests, no legendary engineers, no birth of Western civilization as we know it. If Italy never actually gave birth to the Roman Empire, our modern world would be completely, entirely unrecognizable. The whole shebang, the languages we speak, the religions we practice, the buildings we live in, the laws we follow, they're all just ripped right out of the history books. So let's step into this alternate timeline and see exactly how the fate of Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and honestly the entire globe changes forever.
Now, just look at the stark contrast here. In our timeline, Rome basically became this massive machine, imposing order all across the known world. But in this alternate reality, there is no single superpower dominating the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, you've got a super messy, incredibly competitive balance of power. Carthage, down in North Africa, remains a massive maritime powerhouse for centuries longer, controlling all these vast trade networks. Meanwhile, the Hellenistic kingdoms are just carrying on their own struggles over in the East. Sure, wars absolutely still happen, but they're way more regional, much less organized, and honestly far less globally transformative than the Roman war machine.
So let's start geographically right at the epicenter. The hills, the valleys, the rivers, the coastlines of Italy, they're exactly where we left them. But the real question is, who controls them? Well, instead of this tiny little city called Rome rising up to become the absolute dominant power, Italy just remains this incredibly fractured patchwork of dozens of competing tribes, city-states, and local kingdoms. There's zero disciplined state apparatus that's capable of just swallowing up its neighbors one by one, and there's definitely no universal Italian identity strong enough to forge an empire. Rome just kind of stays a localized city, completely ignored by the wider world. You've got the Latins, the Etruscans, the Samnites, and those heavily armed Greek colonies down in the south. They're constantly trading, bickering, and fighting these endless border skirmishes just to survive. But here is the crucial point. They never actually unite. No single faction ever manages to produce that one unstoppable military juggernaut capable of conquering the Mediterranean. Italy definitely remains super important, mostly just because of its geography, but purely as a busy crossroads for merchants and travelers. It never becomes a global command center.
Okay, let's move outward now, because this lack of unity sends massive cultural ripples across the globe, starting right with the very words you and I use to communicate. In our world, Roman conquest spread their language like wildfire, but without that massive Roman diffusion, Europe never gets Romanized. And you know, language isn't just how we talk, it's the actual architecture of how we think, our identity, our inheritance. In this alternate timeline, that entire foundational architecture gets totally rewritten.
I mean, think about it. Without that Roman diffusion, an entire family of languages just vanishes overnight. French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, they literally never exist because they're all just descendants of Latin. Even English, which borrows heavily from Latin for like half its vocabulary, would sound completely alien to us today. Instead, Celtic languages would stay totally dominant across Gaul and Britain, and the Iberian languages would remain this wild mix of local tongues and Phoenician influences. If you dropped into this modern version of Europe, the linguistic map would feel completely foreign. You wouldn't understand a thing.
Moving on, we really have to look at how the lack of a universal empire radically changes the spread of the world's major religions. It's a huge roadblock. Now, Christianity began independently of Roman political power, so yes, it would absolutely still exist, but without that massive network of paved Roman roads making travel safe and easy, and without the later backing of the emperors, it just doesn't spread anywhere near as fast. Missionaries are stuck relying entirely on slower, way more dangerous local trade routes. Because of that, a universal church develops so much more slowly, and the whole dynamic between church and state turns into something else completely.
This table here brilliantly illustrates the shift. The very foundations of Western society are completely upended. Without Roman roads and administrative reach, the papacy never rises up in Rome. The spiritual map of the world has to be rebuilt from scratch, anchoring around entirely different hubs like Constantinople, Alexandria, or Antioch. Meanwhile, imperial power stays anchored to Carthage or those Hellenistic kingdoms. And as for law, that dream of a universal, centralized legal system stretching across a continent is completely shattered. Medieval kings and modern states are forced to just rely on localized, customary laws that might change drastically just walking from one village to the next.
Okay, let's dive into the built environment.
Because this lack of centralized law and power bleeds directly into the physical world around us. The Romans give us monumental stone cities, sweeping aqueducts, and the absolute miracle that is Roman concrete. A recipe so brilliant scientists today are literally still studying its chemical properties. And while sure, engineering ideas naturally pop up in multiple places over time, without the grand Roman blueprint and that massive imperial treasury footing the bill, these innovations just don't spread with the same lightning speed or uniformity.
Take a look at this timeline. In the 1st century, there are 0 continental road networks or monumental aqueducts being built across Europe. By the 5th century, there's no dramatic fall of Rome to leave behind a massive power vacuum for the church to swoop into or to violently forge feudal Europe. Fast forward all the way to the 15th century, and because of this massive infrastructural gap, European urbanization, long-distance trade, and military logistics are all heavily delayed. Humanity is obviously still building impressive things, but without that signature Roman template, Europe stays much more rural, disconnected, and intensely localized.
And that infrastructural gap totally reshapes the broader Middle Ages. The Middle Ages in our world were basically defined by inheriting the Roman collapse, living in the shadow of this fallen giant and constantly trying to reclaim its past glory. But this alternate Europe, it just remains a mosaic of smaller states. There's literally no imperial ghost to chase, no grand imperial capital to romanticize, and absolutely no classical legal system to preserve. The Germanic kingdoms just evolve completely on their own without ever having to negotiate with the remnants of Roman institutions.
Which brings us to the erasure of one of the absolute most famous cultural explosions in human history, the Renaissance. In our timeline, Italy became the epicenter of this massive cultural movement precisely because it was quite literally sitting on top of preserved Roman and Greek knowledge. People were constantly digging up ancient statues and classical texts, but without the Roman Empire, the entire foundation for this cultural rebirth simply isn't there to be rediscovered in the first place. Let's walk through exactly why. First, there are no classical Roman ruins left behind to inspire a whole new generation of painters and architects to emulate that grandeur. Second, there's no overarching Latin scholarly tradition dominating the education system and preserving ancient Greek knowledge. Because these massive pillars are just gone, Europe's great cultural rebirth likely shifts entirely away from Italy. It probably moves instead to thriving, wealthy centers of trade and learning like Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba. The Italian Renaissance, as we know it, simply never happens.
And that is a profound symbolic loss for Western history. As historians often point out, if Rome never becomes a mythic center of civilization, then later Europeans have to find another myth. Rome basically became the story the world told itself about power, order, and endurance. Without it, the whole aesthetic of authority changes completely. Just imagine our government buildings and public squares without arches, domes, or those classic columns. Later empires would be forced to evoke Athens, or Carthage, or Persia, or they'd have to invent a completely new architectural language from scratch just to project their power.
Finally, let's zoom way out to see the big picture. When you combine all of these missing pieces, the roads, the laws, the language, the myth itself, it completely alters the geopolitical balance of the entire modern world. Rome was essentially the main conduit that pushed ancient Mediterranean culture north and west. Without it, the much later rise of European colonial powers is shaped by a completely different civilizational background, and that drastically changes how they interact with the rest of the globe.
So what we're left with is a Europe that is drastically less legally standardized and significantly less ideologically unified. Without that shared heritage and the ideological confidence they inherited from the memory of Rome, Europe's capacity to project colonial power overseas is heavily crippled. The age of exploration might be severely delayed, or honestly entirely dominated by other cultures altogether. And because of that, the global balance of power remains firmly centered on the Islamic world, China, and India for centuries longer than it did in our timeline.
It's wild to think about, right? History is incredibly fragile. It turns on countless little decisions that easily could have gone another way. If Rome had never become Rome, the world would definitely still exist, but it would be stranger, far less familiar, and in so many ways incredibly uncertain. So, I'll leave you with this. If Rome had never actually risen, which part of our modern world do you think would change the most? The languages we speak, the religions we practice, or the entire shape of Europe itself?